All right, so let's start this broadcast with the latest bit of information that has just come in, where according to report, there are clashes that are taking place in the northern district of Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital. There are reports of gunfire that is being heard from near government buildings in the Ukrainian capital as the Russian soldiers begin to close in on the Ukrainian capital. At this point of time, it is not very clear as to how large is the scale of fighting for the battle for the Ukrainian capital, but this is the information that is trickling out, that there is fighting that is now taking place on the outskirts of the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. And also to give us more perspective in terms of what Russia is, of course, trying to achieve with this invasion of Ukraine, we are joined in by Russian affairs expert Fred Weir, who is in fact joining us from Moscow. Mr. Weir, thank you very much indeed for taking time out and speaking to WION. And let me begin by asking you this: what is Moscow trying to achieve through this invasion that it has launched into Ukraine?
Well, this clearly goes far beyond Vladimir Putin's long-standing demand that Ukraine adopt neutrality, a posture of non-alignment, or simply rejecting military blocs, especially NATO. That was something that might have been negotiated earlier with the West. Some international treaty might have prevented this war, which is not to absolve Vladimir Putin for this really reckless and dangerous step he's taken to invade Ukraine. But there is no doubt now his goals are far greater. That I think this is clearly what the Americans call a war of regime change. Mm-hmm. They intend to change the government as well as the geopolitical alignment of Ukraine.
Do you think the Russians would be satisfied with a regime change in Kyiv? Because back in 2014, when Russia had invaded into Ukraine, it annexed Crimea. This time round, do you think Russia would stop at just a regime change, or would it want to annex more territory from Ukraine?
They annexed Crimea. It's a special case because it was almost completely Russian and certainly pro-Russian. You know, I mean, I'm not advocating this either, but the annexation of Crimea occurred without a single casualty. See, what is happening here is very different, and the Russians have known all along that annexing the rest of Ukraine isn't an option. It isn't. I mean, they are using American tactics and American methods for conducting a regime change operation, but one hopes they've learned from American experience that you really can't occupy a country and transform it into the kind of creature you want it to be. I think that's one of the solid lessons of the 21st century. So I think the Russian goal is less than incorporating Ukraine into Russia, but it will involve perhaps partitioning the country. So right. The more Russian-speaking, pro-Russian eastern half of the country may acquire some new status. And indeed, as we speak, the forces of the Donetsk and Lugansk Republic are moving forward to seize the whole of Lugansk and Donetsk provinces. They had only controlled a third of them up until now. They claim the whole territory of those provinces as theirs. So that right there will be a de facto partition of Ukraine. But what about the rest of the country? It's still up in the air. And these are early days, you know. I'm sure you've seen this sort of thing before. These wars are not that uncommon in our times, and the first days are always pretty murky.
And also the reason why we are in the situation that we find ourselves in, where the Russian troops are virtually on the doorsteps of Kyiv, is because the political dispensation in Kyiv wanted to move closer to Europe. It wanted to be a part of the NATO military alliance. Americans and the NATO military alliance, it had said that it is still considering it would not completely bar out Ukraine because Russia was demanding it as a security guarantee. Do you think there is an issue in terms of NATO's policy, where when it wants to induct new nations into its military alliance, and in the interim, when that is being worked out, those nations can in fact come under threat, as what has happened clearly with Ukraine?
I think there'll be plenty of time in future to sort this out, but yes, the short answer is yes, I think there's a lot of blame to go around here. This insistence that Ukraine and Georgia too would eventually join NATO just made the Russians see red spots before their eyes and did play a role in leading up to this crisis. You can just imagine if, say, Venezuela or Nicaragua or Cuba announced that they want to join a Chinese-led military alliance, the discourse in Washington wouldn't be all about, well, they're sovereign countries, they have the right to choice, etc., would it? That principle that NATO clung to instead of doing some creative negotiating over a new status, a new security order for Europe, is part of the cause. That's the answer. But it really isn't a topic of discussion for today.
Can Russia realistically aim at solving the problem that it thinks it has in Ukraine, even if it were to install a more friendlier president in Kyiv? Because the last time it tried it in 2014, a Moscow-friendly president was in fact pushed out of power. And again, you had a completely different scenario that played out since then. So even if Moscow were to repeat that experiment, is there any guarantee that the president in Kyiv will continue to remain friendly to Moscow?
Well, first of all, it should be pointed out that Moscow-friendly president, Viktor Yanukovych, was freely and fairly and legally elected. I was in the room in 2010 when all the international observers declared him freely and fairly elected. And he was elected because vast numbers of Ukrainians, being Russian-speaking, being sort of Russian-oriented, voted for him. And so it isn't, you see, before Russia actually invaded Ukraine, I would have said their chances of weaning Ukraine away from the Western direction into a more, certainly a neutral stance were pretty good. But Russia has just abolished all those opportunities. This is a changed world. Certainly in this region, nothing will be the same again. And what Putin can realistically expect to do is hard to say. But we all know that occupations, even if you think they're supposed to be fast and decisive, often get bogged down and turn into nightmares. And I fear very much for Ukraine and also for Russia. I've lived here a long time. I have Russian family and a lot of friends, and I really fear that this war will also corrupt and polarize this society. Wars can do that, and so it's what Putin's end game is, what he thinks it is, and what it might be are different things, and it's a very, very worrisome time.
Right, now the next question, the last question that I want to ask you is a little speculative, because if Vladimir Putin gets his way in Ukraine, do you think he will stop at Ukraine, or would he also next be looking at other breakaway former Soviet Union republics and would want to exert his sphere of influence on them as well? I'm referring to the Baltics here.
No, they're members of NATO, and I don't think anyone in Russia wants to tangle directly with NATO. Just as you see, NATO doesn't want to tangle with Russia in Ukraine. The treaty obligations would bind all the countries of NATO, including my own homeland of Canada, to fight for the Baltic states. Chapter 5 of the NATO Charter clearly states an attack against one is an attack against all. So no, I think everybody in Russia understands that. I talk regularly with Russian security experts, people who are connected with the Kremlin. They know and understand that. No, what Putin has in mind is changing the former Soviet space, what's left of it, especially Ukraine, but Georgia, Kazakhstan, Moldova maybe, to keep them out of NATO and the Western orbit. But I don't think his ambitions extend beyond that.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Weir, for joining us and getting us all those updates there.
Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.